So the topic for today's class is benign and malignant proliferative lesions of the colon and rectum. So we are moving on to discuss the pathology of the large intestine now. That includes your colon, the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and the rectum. Okay. So the proliferative lesions of the large intestine, they present predominantly as outpouchings or outgrowths that project above the surface of the mucosa, that is the polyps. Now, the benign proliferations are, they are called polyps, and different polyps, these proliferations to begin with, the polyps, they are benign to begin with, but some of these polyps have an increased propensity to subsequently, over a period of time, turn into malignancy. And some of these are even said to be precursor lesions for adenocarcinoma of colon because of such increased propensity that almost most of them ultimately progress to develop adenocarcinoma. All right. So depending on their propensity to undergo malignant transformation, these polyps are further, they are classified as non-neoplastic polyps and neoplastic polyps, right? So non-neoplastic polyps these are the three types of non-neoplastic polyps we will be reading about: hyperplastic polyps, inflammatory polyps, and hamartomatous polyps. And the neoplastic polyps, the most common ones are called as adenomas. And depending on the architecture, the adenomas are further classified as tubular adenomas, tubulovillous adenomas, or villous adenomas. And we'll be discussing them in details later. So I'll tell you what do these terms mean. So let's first read about and understand about polyps before we begin on to discuss about the adenocarcinoma of colon, which is an important topic for you. So, stated in simple term, in a very crude language, a polyp is a grossly visible protrusion from the mucosal surface. Now, this polyp, it is sort of attached to the surface. Now, either it may have a narrow, elongated stalk. If it is present, it is called as pedunculated polyp. And if this outgrowth is just sitting directly above the mucosa without an intervening stalk, it is said to be sessile polyp. And these terms have actually been adopted from botany, where we use these terms. Now, most of the polyps to begin with, they are small sessile elevations only. They are sessile to begin with. And subsequently, over time, when this protruding part is subjected to the traction because of the passing fecal matter through the colon, this traction on this protrusion results in elongation, and a stalk is formed when it becomes pedunculated. It may not be true for all the polyps, but this is the usual mechanism that happens. So maybe all the polyps to begin with are sessile, and then subsequently they become pedunculated. Okay. Now we begin with hyperplastic polyps. Hyperplastic polyps are most commonly seen in the left-sided colon, that is your rectum, the sigmoid colon, and these are small nodular protrusions of the mucosa. So this is an endoscopic view, and we see that this is a very tiny little protrusion, and it is sitting on the crest of mucosal folds. So they are smooth nodular protrusions, often situated on the crests of mucosal folds, and they may occur singly or they may even be multiple, and they are seen in the left, as I told, left colon, so sigmoid colon and the rectum. Now, coming to the microscopic pathology, hyperplastic polyps have a very characteristic architecture, and that is the serrations. So you see, this is a blade that has got serrations at there. So this is what is serration. Okay, a zigzag pattern, not a very regular edge, right? So here we see that these glands, here also there is a lot of zigzag outline to this lining epithelium of these polyps, and in the cross section also we see these kind of serrations. And the normal crypt, it has got a very regular luminal outline, but here it becomes irregular zigzag pattern, and this is what is we call as serrated architecture. All right, and the lining cells are similar to the cells that we see in the normal colonic epithelium, that is your goblet cells and the columnar absorptive cells. Morphological hallmark is serrated surface architecture. Hyperplastic polyp, serrated surface architecture. Now, how do these polyps occur? So basically, it may not primarily be because of increased proliferation of cells. Rather, the underlying defect here is decreased shedding of the surface epithelial cells. So these cells are undergoing a process of constant proliferation and shedding and cross. So there is a constant turnover of these cells. And when this turnover of cells is decreased, that is, there is decreased shedding of the cells, so what happens is cells, they tend to pile up. Okay, they tend to, because they are not, the older cells are not shedding off and newer ones are replacing them. So there is piling up of the cells. You see here, there is a lot of piling up of cells, and this results in this serrated architecture. Okay, so there is piling up of goblet cells and absorptive cells. Now, what is the significance of hyperplastic polyps? Hyperplastic polyps do not have a malignant potential. Okay, there is no malignant potential. Then why do we have to read about them, and what is their significance? Now, they architecturally, hyperplastic polyps resemble sessile serrated adenomas, and sessile serrated adenomas are the polyps which have malignant potential. So it's very important to distinguish them from sessile serrated adenoma. That is, a sessile serrated adenoma must not be confused with hyperplastic polyp. Otherwise, we will tend to ignore the lesion which actually has malignant potential. Okay, and how to differentiate this serrated architecture in hyperplastic polyps? This architecture is limited to the upper one-third of the crypt. So if we have an elongated crypt, the upper one-third of that crypt region will show the serrated architecture, while in sessile serrated adenomas, this serration is present throughout the length of the crypt. And when we read subsequently about sessile serrated adenomas in the later part of the lecture, I will again emphasize I will tell in detail about their architecture. Then the second important fact about hyperplastic polyps is that they may occur as a non-specific reaction adjacent to or overlying any mass or inflammatory lesion. So basically, they act as a clue to the presence of an adjacent clinically important lesion. Okay, so if we get a hyperplastic polyp, it may be so that the adjacent mucosa may be harboring a malignancy, or it may be an inflammatory lesion, like that. Okay, now we move on to inflammatory polyps. So inflammatory polyps are nothing but they are protrusions of the mucosa resulting from expansion of the lamina propria, that is infiltrated by abundant inflammatory cells. So this is the general term that is used to describe a small foci of non-specifically inflamed colonic mucosa. So there is no per se neoplastic proliferation, but this protrusion is because of this expansion resulting from the increased inflammation and edema, and this is a non-neoplastic mixture of epithelial and stromal components that are admixed with inflammatory cells. So it can be seen in a number of inflammatory conditions: Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. It may be seen adjacent to a site of anastomosis. It can also occur in cases of ischemic colitis or any infectious colitis. And how does this arise? Because of repeated bouts of intense inflammation and simultaneously occurring injury and simultaneously occurring healing. So cycles of injury and healing, they keep on continuing, and subsequently over a period of time, the mucosa bulges out and forms a polyp called as the inflammatory polyps. So grossly, what we see is they are usually sessile and they are small lesions, less than 3 centimeter, maybe pedunculated or filiform. Now the pseudopolyps that we learned about in the last lecture in the context of ulcerative colitis is also an example of inflammatory polyp. In microscopic pathology, what can we see? So it resembles the normal colonic mucosa, except that there is a lot of inflammation going on. So there is expansion of lamina propria, and this inflammation may result in crypt abscess, cryptitis. These are the terms I have already explained you in the last lecture. So all these changes can be seen because of the inflammation. Also, since there is a lot of inflammation, so the overlying epithelium can show some reactive changes, some atypical changes, which are actually not neoplastic, but in response to the inflammation. So that is called as reactive atypia. Also, it may so happen that the polyp is entirely composed of granulation tissue because of the ongoing healing. All right. So it may be composed entirely of granulation tissue with abundant thin-walled and dilated vascular channels surrounded by mixed neutrophilic and lymphoplasmacytic inflammation. Okay, now another clinical setting in which inflammatory polyp can be seen is solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. Now, solitary rectal ulcer syndrome is a clinical triad of rectal bleeding along with mucus discharge and inflammatory lesion of the anterior rectal wall. Polyps that form as part of this syndrome are also inflammatory polyps. And the pathogenesis is, what happens is in solitary rectal ulcer syndrome, there is impaired relaxation of the anorectal sphincter. So, there is formation of a sharp angle at the anterior rectal shelf, and this leads to recurrent abrasion and ulceration of the overlying rectal mucosa. Also, there is a inflammatory polyp formation, and the entrapment of this polyp in the fecal stream can lead to mucosal prolapse. So that is a complication that can occur in SRUS, or solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. Microscopically, again, same, there is mixed inflammatory infiltrate along with erosion. There is epithelial hyperplasia in response to this inflammation. And when prolapse occurs, the lamina propria will show fibromuscular hyperplasia. That is, we will see strands of smooth muscle extending into the lamina propria. And that is the clue or the identifying feature. When you see the wisps of smooth muscle extending into the lamina propria, this is actually a sign of prolapse, and it is seen in solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. Now we move on to the third type of non-neoplastic polyp, the hamartomatous polyps. Now, hamartomatous polyps, if you just split the term, these are actually hamartomas which produce projections on the mucosal surface, and so they are called polyps. And we know what is a hamartoma from your knowledge of the chapter of neoplasia. Hamartomas are basically disorganized masses of tissue that is native or indigenous to the organ. So, hamartomatous polyps are malformations of tissue elements that are indigenous to the gastrointestinal tract, and they protrude into the visceral lumen. Now, hamartomatous polyps, they are special in the sense that they can occur in the setting of clinical syndromes. Okay, so and more often they are part of syndromes. So they can either occur sporadically, like your hyperplastic polyps and inflammatory polyps, or they can be components of genetically determined or acquired syndromes. Called examples are juvenile polyps and Peutz-Jeghers polyps. Juvenile polyps, when they occur sporadically, they are called retention polyps, and they are usually solitary. When they are syndromic, they occur in association with a syndrome called juvenile polyposis syndrome. Peutz-Jeghers polyps can also occur sporadically or in association with syndrome, and the syndrome goes by the same name, the Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. Now let us start with juvenile polyps. They are focal malformations of the epithelium and the lamina propria. Juvenile, they are seen in children less than 5 years of age, though they can present in older ages as well, because nothing is absolute and there are always variations. Now they are located in the rectum, again the left-sided colon, and they present as rectal bleeding or intussusception, intestinal obstruction, or polyp prolapse through the anal sphincter. Now, juvenile polyposis syndrome is characterized by multiple such polyps, multiple hamartomatous polyps. They can range, there is a very broad range. They can be as little as 3 polyps to as many as hundreds of hamartomatous polyps. And colectomy may be necessary. Why? Because since there are so many polyps and all of them are very prone to bleeding, so severe hemorrhage can occur. And to limit this chronic severe hemorrhage, colectomy is often necessary in these patients. Minority of the patients, they not only have polyps in the colon and rectum, they can even have polyps in the stomach and small bowel. So a syndrome is we know by definition, it's there is constellation of diseases is what forms a syndrome, and there are a lot of multiple organs that are affected. So in the GIT, apart from colon, the polyps can occur in stomach as well as in the small intestine, and when they are present in this setting, they can undergo malignant transformation. Okay, so in the syndromic setting, juvenile polyps have a malignant potential. Apart from this, the extraintestinal manifestations are also a part of this syndrome and include pulmonary arteriovenous malformation and other congenital malformations. They are the extraintestinal manifestation of juvenile polyposis. Okay, so this is a juvenile polyp. This is the gross photograph. It has got a smooth surface, and they are few millimeters. They can vary in size from few millimeters to up to 3 centimeters. They are typically pedunculated, smooth surface, and they have these when you cut open this polyp, they have got these multiple dilated cystic spaces. And when you see on microscopy, these cysts are actually the dilated glands filled with mucin and inflammatory debris. And this polyp, this is the polyp, this is the whole mount view. This is showing the lamina propria admixed with mixed inflammatory infiltrates. And so in the inflammatory polyp also you have an expansion of lamina propria with lot of, but there it is primarily inflammation which is causing destruction of the crypts, and you see very less of these glands or these crypts. While in juvenile polyps, you see many of these glands and they are cystically dilated and filled with mucin and inflammatory debris. Muscularis mucosae may be normal or attenuated, so you don't see the muscularis mucosae in the extending lamina propria, which was seen in case of solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. inflammatory polyp in association with solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. So what is the pathogenesis? Now the initiating event is mucosal hyperplasia. So juvenile polyps, they have got a genetic basis. Genetic basis, that is, we have identified that certain mutations occur as part of the pathogenesis. That is, there are certain mutations in the genes that regulate cellular growth, and they result in the autosomal dominant juvenile polyposis syndrome. And the most common mutation that has been identified is in the SMAD4 gene. Now, SMAD4 gene is a very important component of the TGF beta signaling pathway. And the TGF beta signaling pathway is one of the pathway that inhibits cell proliferation and growth. So it has an inhibiting effect, this pathway. So when the SMAD4 gene undergoes mutation such that there is loss of function and TGF beta pathway is hampered, then there occurs unrestricted proliferation and results in juvenile polyps. Now, these patients, they have juvenile polyposis as well as hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasias. This is another manifestation of this mutation. Now, in patients who do not have SMAD4 mutation, another mutation that has been discovered is DMPR1A gene mutation. Now what is the function of this gene? It is a kinase and it is a member of TGF beta superfamily. So there is a mutation of the receptor itself, the TGF beta receptor. Okay, again the TGF beta pathway is affected with this mutation. So both these mutations together, these mutations combined, they are not responsible for all the juvenile polyps. That is, not all the polyps will have either of the two mutations. Rather, they have been found in less than half of the patients. So that means there are more genes that are yet to be discovered in the pathogenesis of juvenile polyposis syndrome. Now, what is the relationship of dysplasia and juvenile polyps? Now, dysplasia is rare in sporadic setting, but in a syndromic setting, if a juvenile polyp is occurring as part of a juvenile polyposis syndrome, then it is likely to be associated with dysplasia, and both within the polyp as well as in the separate adenomas. And 30 to 50% of the patients with juvenile polyposis will develop colonic adenocarcinoma by the age of 45 years. All right. So in a syndromic setting, there is higher chance of progressing into malignancy, and in the syndromic setting, the malignancy is also present at a earlier age group compared to the sporadically occurring carcinomas which occur in 6 to 7 decades. Now we come to the second type of hematomatous polyp that occurs in the setting of Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. This is again autosomal dominant syndrome, and here what is the presentation? Apart, there are multiple GI hematomas, that is, these polyps can occur anywhere in the gastrointestinal tract, combined with mucocutaneous hyperpigmentation. It presents at an early age of 11 years, and mucocutaneous hyperpigmentation patients generally present as dark blue to brown macules involving the lips, nostrils, buccal mucosa, the palmar surface of the hands, and the genitalia in the perianal region. So this is what is called mucocutaneous hyperpigmentation, which is the first identifying feature and a clue towards if we see these features, then we must start looking for the other associated diseases of this syndrome, and we must look for the presence of polyps. The Peutz-Jeghers polyp can initiate intussusception, which is occasionally fatal. So patient may also present as an emergency with an intussusception and subsequently is diagnosed to be suffering from a polyp, and then the diagnosis of this syndrome is made. And it raises a markedly increased risk of several malignancies. So not only the gastrointestinal malignancies, but various patient is prone to various other malignancies also, like sex cord tumors of the testis, and therefore regular surveillance is recommended in these patients. So once the patient has been diagnosed as Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, we must start, the patient is booked for regular surveillance, and timely screening of the patient is very, very important. Regular screening is important to look for the malignancies that are known to be associated with this syndrome. So in late childhood, patient can develop gastric and small intestinal cancers. In the second and third decades of life, they are very prone to develop carcinomas of the colon, pancreas, breast, lung, ovary, and even uterine cancers. Alright, so these syndromes are really very clinically significant to identify early so that these malignancies can be picked up early. So what are the genetic mutations that have been identified? The STK11 gene is the gene implicated in Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. So you must learn this. This is also important for your competitive examinations. So germline heterozygous loss of function mutations in STK11 gene is seen in half of the individuals with familial Peutz syndrome, and they have also been identified in the sporadic Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. So when the gene mutation occurs, is present, it is the germline mutation that has been inherited. It is called the familial Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. And when these loss of function mutations occur uh, later on, subsequently, that is, they are somatic mutations, not germline mutations, and we call it sporadic Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. So this gene happens to be a tumor suppressor gene, so both its allele must be lost. It regulates the AMP-activated protein kinases, which control the cell polarization and acts as a brake on growth and anabolic metabolism. So once this gene is gone, there is loss of function mutation. This AMP kinase is unregulated, and there is no brake on growth and anabolic metabolism, and so proliferation occurs. Now, so second allele is lost either through mutation, that in cancers, providing an explanation for the high-risk neoplasia in affected patients. Okay. Now, absence of these mutations does not exclude the diagnosis of Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, because again, here also multiple other mutations are also present and which are yet to be discovered. Now, grossly, these polyps, they have got a very lobulated kind of appearance. So you see these multiple lobules are seen on the surface of the polyp, lobulated contour, and they are seen in the small. They can be seen in small intestine. They can be seen in stomach, in the colon. They can even be seen in bladder and lungs, but at a much lower frequency. So as part of the syndrome, they can occur at multiple sites throughout the GI tract and even in the bladder and even in the lungs. So this is a whole mount view. So you see the now Peutz-Jeghers polyps, they have got a very characteristic histomorphology. They have got an arborizing or branching Christmas tree-like pattern. So it has got a very tree-like branching pattern, and this is an arborizing network of connective tissue of the smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is also coursing through these branches, lamina propria, glands, and all these glands, they're all very irregular, elongated, branching kind of glands. So that is how it is differentiated from juvenile polyps, because smooth muscle bundles are also admixed in this branching network. So we see smooth muscles also extending into the branches of this tree. Versus juvenile polyps, where we do not see, rather the muscularis mucosae is flat, or it is normal, or it is attenuated in the juvenile polyps. Now, hematomatous polyps, apart from the juvenile polyposis syndrome and Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, they can occur in association with other syndromes like Cowden syndrome, where where the PTEN gene is mutated, part of PI3K-AKT pathway, and there are other lesions like lipomas, ganglioneuromas, and the extraintestinal manifestations include skin tumors, thyroid and breast lesions, and there is no increased risk of gastrointestinal malignancies in these patients. Another syndrome is bronchitic Canada syndrome, which is non-hereditary. The cause is really not known. And apart from the hematomatous polyps, these patients can have nail atrophy, hair loss, abnormal skin pigmentation, cachexia, and anemia. And it may be fatal in 50% of the patients. Then the tuberous sclerosis, where TSC1 or TSC2 genes are mutated, they can also have hematomatous polyps in the gastrointestinal tract. Apart from the other known manifestations of tuberous sclerosis, that is the intellectual disability, epilepsy, cortical tubers, renal angiomyolipoma, facial angiofibromas. Now we move on to the neoplastic polyps. It is very important because they have identified, they have been recognized as precursor lesions for colonic adenocarcinomas. The most common neoplastic polyps are the colonic adenomas, which are precursors to majority of colorectal adenocarcinomas. They are epithelial neoplasm. They range from small pedunculated polyps to very large sessile lesions, again quite broad range of size. Now, individuals who have a family history of colorectal adenocarcinoma are typically screened colonoscopically for presence of these polyps at least 10 years before the youngest age at which a relative was diagnosed. So, if in a family a patient has been diagnosed as colonic adenocarcinoma, then the close relatives of that patient, we start screening them for presence of these adenomas, because usually it is in most of the colonic adenocarcinomas, the precursor lesion is colonic adenoma, which progresses to adenocarcinoma. So this, however, this is one pathway in the pathogenesis of colonic adenocarcinoma. It is not that all the adenocarcinomas will, to start with, have an adenoma. There are other pathways as well, which I will be elaborating upon subsequently. Now, previously it was recognized predominantly as a disease of the West, but its incidence has been rising even in the Asian countries because of as Western diets and lifestyles have become more prevalent here. So this is an adenoma. It has again 0.3 to 10 centimeter in diameter. It can be pedunculate to the sessile. Now surface is very velvety and they are very reddish juicy looking polyps, and these are velvety or raspberry like gross appearance. On microscopy by definition, adenomas have dysplasia. So the glands in the adenoma will show features of dysplasia. Dysplasia defined by the nuclear features of nuclear enlargement, elongation, hyperchromasia, and stratification. So I repeat, adenomas are characterized by presence of epithelial dysplasia, characterized by nuclear hyperchromasia, elongation, and stratification. And these changes are very well appreciated at the surface of the adenoma. So they start from the surface. Now, apart from these nuclear features, these cells, these plastic cells, they can also have prominent nucleoli, eosinophilic cytoplasm, and there is a reduction in the number of goblet cells. So that is a clue. You see in a low power that the goblet cells appear to be less, and there is a lot of blue looking, there is a lot of blue appearance on low power. You need to move to high power and concentrate and look for these dysplastic features. Pedunculated adenomas have got a slender fibrovascular stalk containing prominent blood vessels derived from the submucosa, and stalk is covered by the stalk may be covered by non-neoplastic epithelia. So it is mainly the surface that will show the presence of dysplasia. And based on the architecture, they can be tubular adenomas. They are generally small in size, and they're composed of these rounded or elongated tubular glands. Or they can be villous adenomas, where there are these finger-like or villus-like projections on the surface, and they tend to be larger polyps. And then we also have polyps where a mixture of these two patterns are seen, and they are called as tubular villus adenomas. Now, villus adenomas tend to harbor cancers more frequently compared to tubular adenomas, but it may not be by virtue of their architecture alone, because as we know, villus adenomas tend to be larger. So, by virtue of their size, they may be having increased propensity to harbor malignancies or to undergo malignant transformation. Now, another type of adenoma is a sessile serrated adenoma, about which I had mentioned when I was telling about hyperplastic polyps. So they have got a serrated architecture, just like the hyperplastic polyps. Difference being, this serrations is confined or is seen throughout the length of the crypt. Also, the sessile serrated adenomas are seen on the right side. They are more commonly seen on the right side. While your hyperplastic polyps, they are seen more commonly on the left-sided colon. So, despite their malignant potential, now, how are these adenomas different from the tubular or tubular villus adenomas? Is they do not show obvious dysplasia. So, they have malignant potential, just like the traditional adenomas. However, sessile serrated adenomas, they lack typical cytological features of dysplasia. So by virtue of this architecture, we must identify these lesions, we must identify them separate from aplastic polyps, and they may not be showing dysplasia, but they have increased risk of malignant potential. So adenomas, although they are benign lesions, but a small proportion of the adenomas may already harbor invasive carcinoma at the time of detection. And size is the most important characteristic that correlates with risk of malignancy. So let's say if we have two patients with adenomas and we want to know which amongst them has got a higher chance of malignant transformation, then we have to look at the size of the adenoma. Cancer is extremely rare if the adenoma is less than 1 centimeter in diameter. Nearly 40% of the lesions larger than 4 centimeter already contain foci of invasive cancer. And this cancer is called as intramucosal carcinoma if the invasion is confined to the lamina propria. High-grade dysplasia present in adenoma is a risk factor for cancer in the particular polyp, but it does not confer an increased risk of cancer in other polyps. So, the dysplasia in the polyp will confer increased risk of malignancy for that particular polyp. It is not generalized. So, we come on to intramucosal carcinoma. Intramucosal carcinoma is when in adenoma, the dysplasia is usually confined to the gland or the surface epithelium. But when these dysplastic glands or the dysplastic epithelium is sort of breaching the basal membrane and also infiltrating in the lamina propria beneath the glands and the epithelium, then we call it intramucosal carcinoma. Okay. They may even extend up to muscularis mucosae, but they should not go beyond muscularis mucosae. If there is invasion beyond muscularis mucosae, then it becomes invasive adenocarcinoma. Okay, so that is then shifted into the category of invasive adenocarcinoma. So why are the intramucosal carcinomas clubbed with the polyps or with the adenomas, and not why are they considered distinct from invasive adenocarcinoma? Is because the functional lymphatic channels are absent in the colonic mucosa. So the intramucosal carcinomas, they have got a very little or no metastatic potential. So they will not metastasize, and therefore a simple polypectomy is generally curative for these patients. They may not have to undergo colectomy, which is the treatment for early invasive adenocarcinoma. Okay, so I repeat, if the invasion is confined to the lamina propria, it has not gone beyond the muscularis mucosae, it is still called intramucosal carcinoma, and it is treated just like the traditional adenomas, because complete colectomy is generally curative. There is decreased chance of metastasis since functional lymphatics are absent in the colonic mucosa. Okay. While if it has gone beyond muscularis mucosae into the submucosa, then it carries the risk of spread, and so this is called invasive adenocarcinoma. Now, before we go on to the topic of adenocarcinoma, we need to read about two hereditary predisposition syndromes with familial adenomatous polyposis and hereditary non-polyposis colorectal carcinoma. So, this is an autosomal dominant disorder, and patients develop numerous colorectal adenomas as teenagers. So, these are the syndromes that are associated with formation of numerous adenomas. And the mutation that has been identified in these syndromes is the mutation in APC gene. APC gene encodes for APC protein. This is adenomatous polyposis coli gene. APC gene is adenomatous polyposis coli gene. It goes with the same name, adenomatous polyposis. This is the negative regulator of Wnt signaling pathway. Now, you have already read about this pathway in your topic of neoplasia. So, in a resting, now these are the resting colonic epithelial cells. They have got receptor for Wnt receptor. Now, normally when the Wnt is not there, and this pathway is not activated, the beta-catenin usually forms a macromolecular complex that promotes degradation of beta-catenin. Okay, so we do not need beta-catenin at that time. This cell is in a resting stage. Beta-catenin, what is beta-catenin? Beta-catenin promotes gene transcription and translation. So it drives the cell proliferation. So in a resting state, we do not need the cells to proliferate, and beta-catenin undergoes degradation by forming a complex with an important part of this macromolecular complex is the APC protein, and this APC protein is encoded by the APC gene. So when this APC gene is there is mutation of the gene, there is loss of function mutation. So this protein is lost. So what happens is when there is loss of the protein, so the beta-catenin does not undergo degradation, it is not degraded, and its levels in the cytoplasm will increase. And then this beta-catenin will translocate to the nucleus, and this Wnt pathway is activated. Beta-catenin translocates, binds to TCF, which is a transcription factor, and it promotes the transcription of genes that promote cell proliferation. This is in a normal cell, this pathway is activated once Wnt binds to its receptors. But when there is this mutation, even when the Wnt is not there, that is, even when the cell proliferation is not really required, and still there is continued proliferation of the cells, so there is no regulation. There is deregulated proliferation of the cells, and that is how we get these adenomas. Okay, so this is the earliest event to occur in the pathogenesis of adenoma. So these patients, now 75% of these are inherited. That is, this mutation in APC gene is actually germline mutation, but they can also be sporadic. That is, these mutations occur later on. So they can be sporadic familial adenomatous polyposis as well. Or so these patients, now at least 100 polyps are necessary for the diagnosis. For fact, at least 100 polyps are there, should be there, and these patients generally have almost thousands of polyps. So you see, this is the colonic mucosa. Here we see a very large dominant polyp, and the rest of the mucosa is also studded with these very variable size polyps, these small, tiny. It's almost studded with these polyps. So this is the typical appearance of the colon in patients with familial adenomatous polyposis. These are flat and depressed adenomas are also quite prevalent, and they can be microscopic as well. That is, just one or two dysplastic crypts are seen. So you here in this photomicrograph, you see almost 1, 2, and 3, almost 3 adenomas together. Okay, so this is familial adenomatous polyposis syndrome with multiple adenomas. Now, colorectal adenocarcinoma develops in 100% of the untreated FAP patients. There is the risk of malignancy is 100%. So, if a patient has FAP, there is it is almost certain that the patient will develop colorectal adenocarcinoma, and therefore prophylactic colectomy is the standard of care to prevent this carcinoma. They will develop this often before the age of 30, that is at a young age, and nearly always by the age of 50, almost always they will develop the carcinoma. Okay, so colectomy will protect or prevent the colorectal cancer, but these patients also have risk of developing malignancy at other sites, and this risk remains. And these extracolonic sites include ampulla ovata and the stomach. Okay, so they can develop malignancy at other sites as well. Now, APC gene mutation, apart from FAB, it can also be seen in Gardner syndrome, it can be seen in Turcot syndrome, and here also patient develops multiple adenomas, and there are other manifestations, that is extra gastrointestinal manifestations. Like in classic FAB, patient has retinal pigment epithelial hypertrophy. In Gardner syndrome, patient has osteomas, thyroid and desmoid tumors, skin cyst. In Turcot syndrome, medulloblastomas, glioblastoma. And there is another syndrome, MUTYH associated polyposis, where also patient develops adenomas, multiple adenomas. This is another syndrome associated with formation of multiple adenomas, and patient also has gastric and duodenal polyps. Then we come to the second syndrome, which is hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer syndrome, or HNPCC. Now, this syndrome is characterized by a very characteristic gene mutations, the mutations in the mismatch repair gene. So, what do we mean by mismatch repair genes? Now, normally the process of DNA replication in a cell is highly error prone, and when the replication occurs before the cell divides, so in dividing cells, before the cell division occurs, in the S phase, DNA replication takes place. Now, this DNA replication is highly error prone, but we have these mismatch repair genes which sort of recognize, they detect these errors, and they excise and they sort of repair these errors in the DNA replication. When these genes are gone, when there is loss of function mutation, when they are gone, so this spell checker function is also gone. So when all the errors, they go uncorrected. Okay. So if there is an erroneous pairing of G nucleotide with T rather than the normal A with T, the mismatch repair factors, which normally would have corrected this defect, now with the loss of this proofreading function, all these errors will sort of start accumulating throughout the genome. As the cells continue to proliferate, these errors continue to accumulate in the genome. And when these mutations involve the genes that are involved in cell proliferation, then some of these mutations actually become driver mutations, and they cause carcinogenesis. That is why patients with HNPCC are at increased risk of developing malignancy. Again, not only malignancy in the colorectum, but in various other organs. Okay. So I repeat, there is mutation in the mismatch repair genes, because of which the mutations accumulate throughout the genome, and these mutations can be driver mutations causing carcinogenesis. Now, there are at least five mismatch repair genes have been identified. The most important ones are MSH2 or MLH1. Now, patients who have this syndrome, they are born with one mutant allele, and then subsequently the normal allele function is also lost, either by inactivating mutations or by epigenetic events. So these alleles, normal alleles, they may not, these gene alleles may not actually be mutated, but they are silenced. That is, their expression is inhibited by some epigenetic factors like methylation. Okay, so they are when the second copy is lost through mutation or epigenetic silencing, defects in the mismatch repair occur and lead to accumulation of mutations at rates up to 1,000 times higher than the normal. Okay. Now, the hallmark of this mismatch repair defect is microsatellite instability. So, another term very important in the context of HNPCC is microsatellite instability, or MSI. What is a microsatellite? These are tandem repeat sequences of 1 to 6 nucleotides, and they are distributed throughout the genome. In normal individuals, the length of these microsatellites will sort of remain constant. But in individuals who have got mismatch repair defects, all these microsatellite sequences, because of the accumulating errors and mutations, these satellites are of variable length, and they are sort of very unstable. They are not of constant length, so they are very unstable, and that is what we call microsatellite instability. And this is the hallmark. That is, this is how we look for this microsatellite instability to identify the patients with HNPCC. Okay. So the human genome contains 50,000 to 1 lakh microsatellites, which are prone to undergo expansion during DNA replication, and they represent the most frequent sites of mutations in HNPCC. HNPCC is also known as Lynch syndrome. The cancers, as I told earlier, not only in the colorectum, but they are also prone to develop malignancies in the endometrium, stomach, ovary, ureter, brain, small bowel, hepatobiliary tract, pancreas, and skin. So it's very important to identify these patients. And this pathway or this HNPCC is the most common syndromic form of colon cancer. 2 to 4% of all colorectal cancers patients are actually patients of HNPCC. And the cancers, they tend to occur at younger age, just like in any other syndromic pathology. Early presentation is the feature, and they present at younger age compared to sporadic colon cancers. Also, these cancers tend to occur in the right-sided colon. So now we come to the final topic, that is adenocarcinoma, which is the malignant proliferation. This is the most common malignancy of the gastrointestinal tract and is a major cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide, responsible for 10% of all cancer deaths worldwide. And peak ages 60 to 70 years. This is for sporadic cancers, as we have already seen in association with syndromes, that is FAP syndrome or HNPCC. The cancers occur at quite early age, even at 30 years of age. Now, the low intake of unabsorbable vegetable fiber and high intake of refined carbohydrates and fat have been identified as possible dietary risk factors, though we do not really understand the mechanistic relationship. But the possible hypothesis is that when there is reduced fiber content, so there is decrease in the stool bulk. So what happens is there is also decrease in the passage time, there is increase in the stool passage time, and also it results in altered composition of intestinal microbiota. So this results in increased synthesis of toxic oxidative byproducts of bacterial metabolism and increase in the contact time with the mucosa because of reduced stool bulk. So all this will have a toxic and increased mutagenic potential of the colonic epithelium. Then, when there is high fat intake, it enhances hepatic synthesis of cholesterol and bile acids, and they are converted into carcinogens by the intestinal bacteria, which actually have been altered because of the altered composition of the stool because of reduced fiber content. So, these are the possible hypotheses for the risk factors that have been identified in association with colorectal adenocarcinoma. That is the sporadic ones. Now, in the pathogenesis of adenocarcinoma, both genetic defects as well as epigenetic defects have been identified. Epigenetic defect means the non-coding regions of that are having an influence on the coding regions. So the genes are actually normal, but these are the epigenetic changes that are causing silencing of the gene. The methylation-induced gene silencing is an epigenetic defect. Genetic defects can be seen in either the APC beta-catenin pathway. We have already talked about the APC beta-catenin pathway, how APC protein as part of a macromolecular complex promotes the degradation of beta-catenin. And once this protein function is lost, beta-catenin increases and causes cell proliferation. And even patients who do not have APC gene mutation, they may have mutated beta-catenin. That is, beta-catenin is not under the influence of APC. APC may be normal, but this beta-catenin is resistant to the degradation by APC. Okay, and so there is unregulated execution of this pathway. Then the other pathway is the MSI pathway, about which also I have already mentioned in HNPCC that there is microsatellite instability because of mismatched repair gene defects. So these are the genetic defects, and epigenetic changes can also cause the can also affect the genes of these pathways and result in carcinogenesis. The tumor suppressor genes may be silenced by methylation of CpG-rich zones. So we know that every gene has at its in the 5' region of the gene, there are CpG-rich zones, which are called as CpG islands. And these CpG-rich zones actually include the promoter region of the genes. So if they are undergo methylation, then the promoter is silenced, and so that is how the gene gets inactivated. So in the pathogenesis, the most important pathway is the adenocarcinoma sequence. So we have already seen the APC gene mutation is the earliest event to occur. In patients with FAP, they have germline mutations inherited, or they may be having some acquired mutations. That is, one allele function is lost. Then the second allele may either undergo mutation or it may be silenced by methylation, that is epigenetic event. and so there is increased progression or increased in the APC beta catenin pathway, increased cell proliferation. As the cells undergo continued deregulated proliferation, they are prone to develop more mutations. So KRAS mutations can occur. Now KRAS mutations have been identified in 10% or less than that of adenomas, while they are seen in almost all carcinomas. So we can say that KRAS mutation is a later event to occur during this course. Okay, so some of these adenomas, they may they may undergo further mutations, and mutation when it occurs in KRAS gene activating mutations, because this is a oncogene. So and plus there is accumulation of some additional gene mutations, for example SMAD2 and 4 gene, which is the part of TGF beta pathway, then TP53 mutations, and then telomerase mutations. So there is gradually progressive accumulation of these mutations slowly and gradually, and subsequently adenomas will undergo transformation into carcinomas. The second pathway is the MSI pathway, and these tumors are said to be MSI high or MSI H tumors. So this is the normal colon in a patient with HNPCC. They have germline or somatic mutation in one of the alleles of the DNA mismatch repair gene, that is MLH1, MSH2, MSH6, PMS1, and PMS2. These are the 5 mismatch repair genes. So when the the function of second allele is lost because of mutation or because of promoter methylation, that is epigenetic event. So they are said to be microsatellite unstable, and this is called a microsatellite instability mutated phenotype. And patient develops sessile serrated adenoma, and there is acute since these patients have mismatch repair defect. So they are prone to develop multiple mutations across the genome. These mutations keep accumulating, and then these mutations involve the genes that regulate growth and differentiation and apoptosis, like the anti-apoptotic gene BAX, the BRAF gene, the TGF beta receptor gene, part of TGF beta pathway, or in TCF4, IGF2 receptors, and others. The patient will subsequently develop carcinoma. So these are the 2 pathways. We have the classical adenoma carcinoma sequence, which is seen in 80% of sporadic cancers, and this sequence is very important for you as an exam question, as well as viva question in your practicals. And we also have the newly discovered. This was the most studied pathway, the most known pathway since time immemorial, and this is a more recently discovered pathway in colorectal carcinogenesis, the adenoma carcinoma sequence and the MSI pathway. Then we have epigenetic events also, which are influencing either of these 2 pathways. A subset of microsatellite unstable colon cancers, they are microsatellite unstable, but they do not have mutation in the mismatch repair enzymes. Rather, they have CpG island hypermethylation phenotype. That is, there is silencing of the mismatch repair genes. So MLH1 promoter region is hypermethylated, thereby reducing the MLH1 expression and repair function. And these tumors also have activating mutations in the oncogene BRAF. Okay, but KRAS and TP53 are not typically mutated in these cancers. So that is the differentiating feature. So they are CIMP or CpG island hypermethylation phenotype. Okay, the patients with microsatellite instability mutator phenotype, they have mutation in the microsatellite in the DNA mismatch repair genes, and patients with SYNC phenotype, CIMP, they basically inactivation of the mismatch repair genes by methylation. Combination of MSI, BRAF mutation, and methylation of specific targets such as MLH1 is the signature of this pathway of carcinogenesis. Then we have small group of colon cancers that display increased CpG island methylation, but there is no microsatellite instability, and these tumors harbor KRAS mutations. TP53 and BRAF are uncommon. While TP53 mutations are common in cancers that do not display the CpG island methylator phenotype. Now, as I've already elaborated upon all the molecular events that lead to colorectal carcinogenesis, are there any morphological correlates for these molecular differences? That is, when we are looking at the cancer through our microscope, in microscopy, or when we're seeing it grossly, are there any morphological features that can act as a clue that, okay, this tumor may be having this type of underlying molecular defect and we must look for it? Yes, there are some clues. So microsatellite instability is very common in sessile serrated lesions. So we have already studied that microsatellite instability, this pathway, is usually more commonly seen in the right-sided colorectal cancers, and sessile serrated lesions happen to be more common in right-sided lesions. So these microsatellite instability is very commonly seen in sessile serrated lesions and also the cancers that arise from them. Invasive carcinomas with microsatellite instability often have prominent mucinous differentiation, peritoneal lymphoid infiltrate. So this is the morphological correlate. So if when we are looking at the through the microscope at a colorectal cancer and we see there is prominent mucinous differentiation, this prominent mucinous differentiation in the tumor cells, and also there are a lot of tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, then we must think of microsatellite instability and we must look for these for this underlying defect, and the patient may actually be suffering from HNPCC. And it's important to diagnose HNPCC because they are also at increased risk for other organ malignancies, and also it has implications for genetic counseling. And also these tumors associated with HNPCC, they differ in prognosis as well as in therapy. So how can we identify? Either through immunohistochemistry, we have got ISS surrogates for mismatch repair genes, that is these mismatch repair proteins, MLH1, MSH2, PMS2, and MSH6, or even by molecular genetic analysis of microsatellite sequences. Now coming to the pathology of adenocarcinomas, grossly, the right-sided colon cancers tend to be polypoid exophytic masses. You see this gross photograph. This is a very large, protruding exophytic cauliflower-like mass projecting into the lumen, and it is growing along just one side of the entire wall. It is not involving the entire circumference, and this is protruding. So, and it does not really cause obstruction because it just goes along one wall of the large caliber cecum and ascending colon. And this is the cut section. You see this, it is sort of protruding now, the polypoid growth. While in the left-sided colon, they tend to be annular lesions. That is, they're circular. They're circumferential, they involve the entire circumference, and so they produce this napkin ring kind of construction. So this is the ring that sort of holds the napkin, and it sort of has a very constricting effect on this napkin, and that is what is the effect this growth has on the colon. It causes luminal narrowing, napkin ring kind of constriction, and to the point of even obstruction. So left-sided colon cancers tend to present as obstruction, and so they present earlier than right-sided colon cancers. These patients will present when there has been continuous ongoing bleeding, so that patient develops iron deficiency anemia, and then the patient will present as with constitutional symptoms of generalized weakness and fatigue by the time the tumor has progressed. Microscopically, the right and left-sided colonic adenocarcinomas have they are similar microscopically. We see these glands that are sort of, they are arranged haphazardly, irregularly, they are enlarged, they are of variable size, some are large, some are small, they are arranged back to back with little stroma in between. Then they also incite the desmoplastic reaction, the stromal reaction in response to this invasion, because they are invading. The lining epithelium resembles that seen in dysplastic epithelium, that is, there is nuclear elongation, hyperchromasia, enlargement, there are prominent nucleoli, eosinophilic cytoplasm. Okay, and now depending on the degree of gland formation, they can be well differentiated, moderately differentiated, or poorly differentiated. So here we see that in this photomicrograph, these are the well-formed glands, but then the rest of the tumor cells are just either forming cords or they are forming a small nest. They're not really forming glands. So this is basically a sort of moving down, it is moving towards poorly differentiated part of the spectrum of differentiation. Okay. Then some of these adenocarcinomas, they may elaborate abundant of mucin, which will accumulate within the intestinal wall. And then it is this association with mucin confers a poor prognosis. Then uncommonly, these tumor cells can have a signet ring morphology. So here we are seeing a cluster of tumor cell, and the individual tumor cell, if we look at the cell, the cytoplasm is completely distended with intracytoplasmic mucin, so that the nucleus is pushed to one side, resulting in a signet ring morphology. So I mentioned signet ring in the context of gastric carcinoma as well, gastric adenocarcinoma. The diffuse type usually has this signet ring morphology. So tumors may be composed of signet ring cells like those in gastric cancer. Now these cancers can develop insidiously and may go undetected for long periods of time. The right-sided cancers most often come to clinical attention by the appearance of fatigue and weakness due to iron deficiency anemia, as I've already told you. So when an elderly man, an older man, or a postmenopausal woman presents with iron deficiency anemia, we must look for GI cancer. The GI cancer may be the cause in an older age group. Then left-sided adenocarcinomas, usually they present as occult bleeding, blood in stools, or changes in bowel habits, cramping, left lower quadrant discomfort. Amongst the prognostic factors for adenocarcinoma, the two most important ones are depth of invasion and presence of lymph node metastasis. Okay, so invasion into the muscular propria significantly reduces the probability of survival, which is decreased further by the presence of lymph node metastasis. Metastasis may involve regional lymph nodes, lungs, and bones. As well as now colon has portal drainage, so the distant site of metastasis is liver, but rectum it does not drain via portal circulation. So anal carcinomas, when they metastasize, liver is usually bypassed because they do not have portal circulation. The poorly differentiated mucinous histologies are associated with worse prognosis errors. These are the other prognostic factors apart from depth of invasion and lymph node metastasis. Mucinous histology, when there is abundant mucin being elaborated by tumor cells, and when they are poorly differentiated with less of gland formation. Now, staging of adenocarcinomas is done by PNM classification. I'm not elaborating on this. You can go through this in your book. Depending on the depth of invasion, we classify the P stage. That is, if it is invades the submucosa, it becomes T1. If it invades the muscularis propria, it is T2. If it reaches pericolorectal tissues, the tumor is said to be T3. And when it invades visible peritoneum or it adheres to adjacent organs or structures, it is T4. Similarly, depending on number of lymph nodes involved, we have the N1 or N2 stage and distant metastasis, again depending on the sites that it has already metastasized. So we have the T stage, the N stage, and the M stage of a tumor. T stage depends on the invasion, depth of invasion. N stage depending on the number of lymph nodes and the group of lymph node involved, and M stage on the site of distant metastasis. So I will just shortly, in short, summarize today's class. We talked about polyps, intestinal polyps. We classified them into non-neoplastic and neoplastic polyps. Neoplastic polyps are further classified as hyperplastic, inflammatory, or hematomatous polyps. Hyperplastic polyps are benign epithelial proliferations. They are most commonly seen in the left colon and rectum. They do not have malignant potential, but they need to be differentiated from sessile serrated polyps, which tend to occur more on the right side, and they have serrated architecture throughout the length of the thread. Inflammatory polyps are a result of chronic cycles of injury and healing. Hematomatous polyps occur sporadically or as part of genetic diseases, and these genetic syndromes include the juvenile polyposis syndrome and Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndromes. And when they occur as part of these syndromes, they have increased risk of malignancy. Okay, so though they are non-neoplastic polyps, the sporadic ones, they are classified in the non-neoplastic polyps, but they have an increased risk of malignancy when they occur in the setting of these syndromes. Benign epithelial neoplastic proliferations are termed adenomas, and the hallmark of adenoma is dysplasia, and they are the precursor lesions of colonic adenocarcinomas. Now, in contrast to the traditional adenomas, sessile serrated polyps, though they have a malignant potential, they do not show cytologic dysplasia, and they morphologically resemble hyperplastic polyps. PAP and HNPCC are the most common forms of familial colon cancers, and the studies of their underlying pathway has helped us to understand the pathways of colonic carcinogenesis, the APC beta-catenin pathway for FAP and the MSI pathway for HNPCC. FAP is associated with APC mutations. Patients typically have more than 100 adenomas, and all patients develop colon cancers before 30 years of age group. It is very, very important to identify patients of FAP and for them to undergo prophylactic colectomy to protect them from cancers. HNPCC is caused by mutations in DNA mismatch repair enzymes, and these patients have far fewer polyps and they develop cancer at older age compared to the FAP patients who develop it at a younger age. Compared to the sporadic colon cancers, FAP and HNPCC typify distinct pathways of neoplastic transformation and progression that are also involved in majority of sporadic colon cancers. And the third pathway is the epigenetic event or the CpG island hypermethylation phenotype that underlies the remaining colon cancers. And nearly all colonic cancers are adenocarcinomas. The two most important prognostic factors are depth of invasion and presence or absence of lymph node metastasis. This is an important question, vital question. It can be, since you also have a gross specimen, what are the important prognostic factors in colonic adenocarcinoma? So I repeat, depth of invasion and presence or absence of lymph node metastasis.